Greetings, Earthlings. Thank you all for coming out, being part of Bioneers with your voices and your hearts and your hands. It's not just a group that engages us intellectually and brings us to tears, but I always want to go back and do something in the earth and for the earth as soon as I leave these meetings. So it's just always a great thrill to hear the inspiring talks and meet so many inspiring people, whether they're on stage or not. So thank all of you for the good work you're doing. I am going to veer terribly from what I promised to talk about 6 months or so ago when folks contacted me, in part because whatever excites me at the moment, I want to try to weave together for you and build on all the things I've learned since I was first contacted. So apologies to sponsors, but this is where my heart is at this moment, and I'd like to share that with you. I'm struck by the fact that it's easy to be despondent listening to all the reports of the damage that climate change is doing, and yet it gives us one more of many good reasons for doing what we should have been doing all along in terms of being better stewards of the earth and better neighbors to one another. And I want to balance the social and ecological goals that I feel we need to do, not only to have a healthy food system, but a healthy society. And so I'm going to talk and sort of crosswalk two kinds of food webs, ones with pollinators in mind, and ones with human health and well-being in mind, and see what we can learn from doing that kind of metaphorical comparison. Now, you all have just suffered climatic catastrophe of biblical proportions, but think about what the North American continent has suffered the last 3 years. 7 million acres damaged by wildfires, and the total statistics aren't in for this year yet, surpassing every record in history for the number of acreage burned. Sea levels rising 60% faster than models anticipated them to. The floods here in the Front Range and that followed in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, scouring thousands, if not tens of thousands of acres of farmland. And the cost of that in billions of dollars and arrested production from those croplands will be felt for several more years. Rangelands may have benefited in this area from all that rain, but farmlands really took a hit. Bill McKibben reminds us that just in Texas alone, 500 million trees died since 2011 in the drought, and 1.2 million cattle died in the borderlands drought of the last several years, separate from what's been going on in the Dakotas with the freeze and the premature snows up there. And more than 2,300 counties were declared drought disasters in 2012, 4 times more than the previous record in American history. Now just imagine if climate change weren't a myth that the Colbert Report and Comedy Central made up. Think how much worse it would be. I'm kidding. I mean, what we're seeing here is not something that we can blame on the warmists as hyperbole. These are things actually hurting the land and hurting the people who live on the land in very dramatic ways. And it's resulted in the largest native seed shortage in history and the largest impact on the pollinators that are part of the many lives that bring us our daily bread. The largest declines in history have been within the last few years. So wrap your minds around those episodic insults that are now happening with greater and greater frequency that affect our food system and indirectly the price of food and pricing it beyond the reach of many of the poor. 26% increase in world grain prices and about a 6% increase in US grain prices since all this began to happen. In light of the impacts of all this global weirding, I want to dedicate this talk to a rufous hummingbird that I rescued as it died out of a shrub on the edge of our orchard. It had come up over 1,000 miles from Mexico and lost half or more of its body weight on its way up from Colima and Jalisco, because the year that I found it dying in our shrub, a catastrophic freeze had happened as far as Sinaloa that killed millions of native plants in the natural vegetation, as well as devastating so much of the winter produce industry of West Coast Mexico that provides us with 60% of all the produce we eat during the winter months in the United States, that virtually there was no nectar resources for that chain of hummingbirds that usually flies all the way from Volcán de Colima in Mexico up to Sitka, Alaska, the longest migration of any animal on the planet if you measure that migration in body lengths. Okay? Got that distinction? It's important to remember. But once you have something die in your hand, that's a good traveler. This animal knew how to travel. It was a true planetary pilgrim. You realize, oh, this is happening right where I live. This animal could not make it any further because of the chain of catastrophes that had happened on its migratory corridor that its ancestors had been traveling for, how many thousand years, we don't know. So if the rest of us are to survive, I believe that the conservation movement, needs to make a paradigm shift. And that paradigm shift has to be in dealing with the extinction of relationships. We've made great progress with curbing the extinction of some species, protecting some habitats, but we still see so many things slipping through our hands. And I believe that it's this extinction of relationships that's now the largest issue that we as a human species, we as a planet, are facing. And those relationships are of all kinds. Plants and pollinators like this Datura and hawk moth, Hyles lineana, that's celebrated in Pima Indian songs several centuries old. Of the relationships between livestock and the microbes that either make milk healthy to drink or make it difficult for us to swallow. And the healing between the agrarian, largely rural communities and the urban, largely environmental movement of the last 50 years. We need to see healing of these many, many relationships that have been tattered, frayed, or broken over the last 50 years. So my premise is that by shifting the focus of what we do as conservationists, as social justice activists, as food producers, as eaters, to focus on restoring the diversity of relationships, of ecological interactions in our foodscape, we can avoid what now many scientists are predicting as food chain collapse. And I'll talk about that in a second. But that's not just going to affect other species, it's going to affect us as well. So you may not be able to read the small print here, but it's saying that if we rebuild soil microbial diversity, pollinator diversity, agricultural crop diversity, to restore our food chains or food webs to their former grandeur and complexity, we enhance our food security and health. And if we do that, we have a modicum of resilience in face of all this climate uncertainty that certainly we want to mitigate against and adapt to, but in many ways at this point seems beyond our control. We have to take right action before we see whether the degree of climate uncertainty and accelerating change begins to abate. We don't know what it will take, how much human action to really reverse or stall that. And ironically today, for those of you who think about human health or soil health or microbial health in our guts or in the guts of livestock, our health is suffering more from an epidemic of absence, the absence of our allies, our allied organisms, than from attacks on us by those other species, whether they're pathogenic microbes or predators. And this is a flip in human history. For the last 10,000 years, we've been sequentially trying to remove ourselves from being eaten by predators or attacked by microbes. And now what's killing us is that we've been so good at wiping those out. And you can read about this in this remarkable book by Moises Velasquez-Manoff, An Epidemic of Absence, and Dr. Daphne Miller's very readable and wonderful book that came out last summer called Pharmacology. Just amazing ways of flipping the world on its head so we really understand all the organisms involved in bringing us our daily bread and bringing us our health. And at the same time, social scientists like Robert Putnam said, you know, we're acting like a species that bowls alone, that plays by itself, and that's having a cost on us. And my own rewrite of a book that was called Why Some Like It Hot, now called Food, Genes, and Culture, talks about this in terms of the diabetes epidemic, which is a nutritional cliff that our society is about ready to plunge over. That's the real fiscal cliff. If we don't solve the obesity and diabetes problem among our kids by 2030, it will be something like a cost of $1.3 trillion a year in Band-Aid attempts to keep the sufferers of diabetes among us alive and active and in harmony with their families. This is going to be so disruptive to our society if we don't begin to link the rise of diabetes to the loss of these interactions. So the vision, I think, for 21st century conservation is not going to be hands-off, but hands-on. It's not going to be lock people out. It's going to be have people participate in the ecosystems again. It's going to be restoring those interactions to healthy relationships, not just to save endangered species, which we must do, or protect habitats, which we also must do. But a paper just a couple of weeks ago in Frontiers in Ecology, a very well-regarded, cutting-edge ecology journal, says the identification and protections of species interactions, not species in isolation, but the interactions, act as hubs in ecological networks, and we need to understand them. That's our most urgent task as scientists, because they're crucial to the development of viable and sustainable land use practices across the world. So this, again, is what his geekiness gives you as a slide that's supposed to be easy to read. This is showing parallels between land health, human health, and community economic health. And I'll have this up on my website for those of you like me who can't read fine print. Why do they keep on making the print on these CD covers so small? Oh, it's my eyes, I see. The whole point of this is that for all three, we have to restore these interactions between ourselves and other species to regain the health that we all once enjoyed. So we come back to Janine Benyus's idea of biomimicry, which I break down into three kinds of mimetic processes: eco-mimicry, ethno-mimicry, paying attention to the wisdom of elders, and biomimicry, paying attention to the shape and the structures of life forms. And what we're trying to do is to keep our species and other species from suffering from this food web collapse is using ecological network theory. This should really be sort of a 3D chart to help guide our restoration of food webs. And we do that by remembering the key features of healthy and resilient food webs, like this aquatic food web, that we see in healthy environments. That we have a lot of different interactions. It's not just monoculture and one food supply chain, but if one avenue breaks down, we have other options. That we have redundancy in the system, that this biocomplexity builds in a lot of options for nourishment. And that we try to keep alive both the intensely active interactors in the system, the ones that interact with the most number of social partners or ecological partners, but we also take care of the rarest of the rare, the marginalized, the ones in our food web that don't get no respect, the ones that are on the tails of the curve in their populations and may blink out like the passenger pigeon did for having a high population that everyone thought could never go extinct, or some of the rare species of just one location that can be obliterated by a single bulldozer blade. So we have that capacity to now look at what food webs are healthy and which ones are brittle, but is it hyperbole to say that we're close to food web collapse? Well, Time magazine doesn't think so. It's asking us to imagine a world without bees, because I think they did this in Boulder, I believe. They went through a grocery store and said that 237 of the 453 items in the produce section, their yields are being affected by the declines of the honeybee. And the honeybee is just one pollinator of something like 3,000 species on this continent. So that's happening for an albeit exotic pollinator that has insinuated itself into the lives of just about every farmer and gardener in America. But perhaps too much focus is just on what's happening to the honeybee, and let's look what's happening at some of their kin. Bumblebees. Some friends of mine, Terry Griswold at Utah State University and his colleagues, have documented 96% decline in the abundance of about 6 different species of bumblebees that have occurred in less than 2 decades, 87% shrinkage in their geographic ranges, and bumblebees pollinate with great effectiveness some crops that honeybees are kind of losers on: tomatoes, eggplants, and many other plants in the nightshade family. So independent of what's happening, honeybees, we're finding other factors knocking out bumblebees. And then finally, have you all heard in the news about the silent fall we're having with monarch butterflies? The lowest numbers recorded since monarch caterpillars and monarchs themselves have been tagged over the last 30 years. For 2 straight years in a row, there are people going back to places where they've tagged monarchs for over a decade and they're not finding any. Okay, this seems unbelievable to us who grew up around monarchs. One time I saw all the leaves on a tree fly away when I was daydreaming in class, and then I realized those weren't leaves. What I thought was leaves was an incredible population of monarchs that just took off all at once. Roundup herbicides combined or being used in the intensity that they are because people are planting Roundup ready soy or corn, GE crops. The herbicides themselves, not the corn, is decimating milkweed populations that the monarchs and an extraordinary community of other insects are dependent upon. And this hurts me deeply because I've gone down with Mexican officials to the monarch reserve in Mexico. This summer I was tagging monarchs in our area from a place where we found that some of the monarchs go to the highlands of Mexico. Some go to the California coast for lifestyle purposes, I think. And some go down to the Gulf of California. And so we have this very rare situation where monarchs are going 3 different directions from the same place, and we need hundreds of people out tagging them, trying to figure out these patterns. But now we're seeing that the hundreds of Mexican kids who every year try to go through the piles of monarch carcasses and find tagged ones are finding less and less bodies there and fewer tags from the Corn Belt at all, which prompts me to propose something that I'm just beginning to shape with the help of some of the great monarch experts in the country and wonderful writers like Barbara Kingsolver, whose flight behavior book was just about monarchs, that we have to stop bashing Monsanto and engage them where they feel their social responsibility lies. And I don't think they can turn their backs on the American children who are in love with monarch butterflies. 4 states of which have declared monarch the state invertebrate or the state butterfly, but thousands of kids are part of the Journey North online environmental education program that are tracking monarchs as they march northward or southward. Hundreds of other kids are going out counting caterpillars in the summer, and tens of thousands are trying to mark monarchs. What if all those kids in the country got in monarch suits with wings and placed paper monarchs on the walls of Monsanto headquarters in St. Louis and said, we're not here to bash you, we're here to engage you in your social responsibility to help us bring milkweeds back and therefore help us bring monarchs back. I've been on farms with older farmers where Roundup is used, but they knew how to use it responsibly. It is Monsanto's obligation as someone producing a powerful chemical to teach people how to use it without damaging species that it's not intended for. And I believe it's possible. And we need to turn around the dynamics in time to save monarch butterflies. So what would it look like, whether Monsanto kicks in or not, whether we took that on as a society, and we're doing a small version of it in a 25-mile watershed in southern Arizona that crosses the border. Now, proposed solution is on-farm restoration of this biodiversity, including milkweeds and other pollinator-attracting plants that will keep a diversity of pollinators, not just honeybees, but what's good for these other pollinators is also good for honeybees. And we need to bring in plants that can keep the generalists there, like the honeybee, the specialists, like the bumblebee, and the rarities like the pipevine swallowtail or the lesser long-nosed bat. All of those need to have habitat restoration if we're going to keep them around. A national park or a nature conservancy reserve is not enough to save a whole stopover for these species. We need a landscape level approach. And so we're trying that out in southern Arizona and northern Mexico. But there's goofy things happening. When we look at some of the plants, like a little wild hibiscus that native bees love in our area. This is data taken from right below my office on Tumamoc Hill, the oldest desert research lab in the world. Since 1900, when people started to take herbarium specimens from that hill to the present, we've seen something like a 31 to 41 day earlier flowering time of that hibiscus, which potentially puts it out of sync with the bees that need its floral and pollen, its nectar and pollen resources. What we're seeing in urban heat islands and in much of the West is a contraction of the spring flowering times. Happens at Gothic in the Rocky Mountain biological lab. It happens down on the desert floor in Tucson. So the spring flowering time is contracted, and the pre-flowering in our gardens and fields is not keeping enough bees there to then extend into the flowering season for our crops. We need sequential mutualisms across the season to make that whole system work. And now we're seeing disruptions. And one way to talk about it, the other direction, maybe not. Yep. Oh, yep, back to the top, I'm sorry. Is thinking about being out of sync with your partner. How many people have ever been out of sync with their partner? Don't answer, no. But what I'm saying is that, what if you were going on your first date with someone and you showed up 3 weeks earlier at the restaurant than that person? Don't go there, but you get the idea. This asynchrony is now happening with all kinds of ecological interactions. So we're using the idea of eco-mimicry to design wildflower plantings and hedgerow plantings that provide a greater diversity of nectar resources at every point in the seasonal cycle. So we want to get rid of these lows here and have the kind of biocomplexity that you see in that chart, which is why we're trying to evaluate the flowering times of all these different hedgerow plants so that we can eliminate those slumps that keep the bees out of sync with their plant partners. We're doing this in one of the poorest counties in the United States, twice the poverty level of even the border states in these border counties. And Arizona is the 5th worst in poverty and the 3rd worst in childhood food insecurity. And the immigration debate has worsened the economy of this area. So we're not just thinking of bees and hummingbirds. We're using them as flagships to bring the community together and create what we call a restoration economy. So on spring equinox last year, we declared our little town of Patagonia, Arizona, the pollinator capital of North America. And thousands of pollinators came in and clapped for, they were finally getting recognition and their self-esteem went up right away. But the point is that by doing a little gesture like that and attracting funds to do the restoration there with farmers and ranchers, not against them, we're creating jobs for a restoration economy that can take the place of the extractive economy that's devastated most of the West. And so we're restoring hedgerows to farms and ranches throughout the borderlands area. On both sides of the border we're working. And some of these are surrounded by wildlands, but we found that they've been the wildlands, not just the farmlands, have been disrupted and lost some of their pollinator populations. We see yield declines of many of the fruit trees in our area. So what we're aiming at is to increase what we call interaction diversity. Now remember this when I talk about the human food chain. We're tracking 56 flowering plants in our area, and which of them are visited by some 127 butterflies, 4 moths, 29 bees, 5 wasps, 14 hummingbirds, and 16 floral visiting birds that build this redundancy and biocomplexity. And we want to make sure that even the ones that have a single pollinator, like the yucca moth that visits a yucca, that we're not doing things to disrupt that mutualism or that symbiosis. Remarkably, while most of the country is losing milkweeds, we have 19 different milkweed species in our county, more than any other county in the country. So if we can learn how to propagate those 19 and tease apart what's affecting them, whether it's drought or herbicides, we can then apply that to areas where milkweeds and monarchs are being depleted. And so we do all this work in a communal setting in events we call pot parties. Now, they are not like the pot parties that went on in Boulder in the 1970s, or the 1980s, or the 1990s, etc. We train citizen scientists in the propagation, outplanting, monitoring, and evaluation of plants. And we talk about citizen science. It's not just having volunteers be data slaves. We involve them in every part of the scientific process because they have observations that we couldn't possibly have because many of them have lived in this place their whole lives. And we're employing high school students, last year 5 in a pilot project in a thing we call Earth Care Youth Corps, where they went around to 8 farms and did this kind of work in rewilding the farmscape. And we're starting at, I'm switching my teaching position from a university like this one with a great research and teaching history to a new little campus in Nogales, Arizona, in a shopping mall to teach nursery propagation, greenhouse propagation, food systems change, and other skills to people who are now unemployed and who've never been to college. So that's the future of my teaching career, trying to get this stuff across to people who need it if they're going to feed their families. And we've had the support of the USDA. It's the first time in 30 years of doing sustainable ag that I finally got a USDA grant. I didn't know whether to immediately turn it down and say, I don't accept government subsidies, something like that. But the point is that the Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program here in the Western states is remarkable. And so we started out with 1 dot on the map in Arizona of a bee-friendly farm, and now we have 8 just in our county alone. But the bottom line about this is that no single farm can save a migratory corridor, can save a landscape level process. And so we need to take the stewardship that works on a single farm, like a Joel Salatin polyface farm, and make sure that before Joel dies, all his neighbors are doing their version of the stuff, rather than just having single farms in isolation.
He was talking last night. We saw him, and he just spoke today up at CSU in Fort Collins. He's here.
He's a madman. He's in 4 states at once. I think there's actually 4 Joel Salatins. He's like the Andy Warhol of the sustainable ag movement. He has like clones around. I'm not against that. I'm against that cloning stuff.
He travels 130 plus days a year now. His son's doing it, so he's inspiring so many.
It's not his son, it's his clone, I'm sure of it. Anyway, the point is that it takes a community to do this kind of work. It cannot be done by a single farmer, and that's why the local food shift work in this community is so important. And I come back to a poem from Rilke as our mission statement for what we're doing in the Borderlands watersheds. All will come again into its strength, the fields undivided, the water undammed, the trees towering, and the walls, like that border wall 12 miles south of my house, built low, and in the valleys people, and as strong and as varied as the land. So how do we take that story from pollinators and apply it to the human food sheds? This is not going to take as long as that first part, so hang with me here for just a couple more minutes. Again, what are the take-home messages from that? Biocomplexity is good. Monoculture and linear food chains are not what we need. We need complex food webs. We need redundancy. I used to think, oh, that, another deja vu all over again. That was redundancy, but redundancy is good stuff. Redundancy is having multiple pathways in your food system. And again, we want the intensive interactors and the rarities to be protected and sustained. Socially, I'm talking about social justice here, not bee justice, okay? So these, as bed hedging strategies, we need to re-diversify the content, composition, and structure of our food webs, especially in a climate uncertain world. We don't need to put all our eggs in one basket. And one way to do that is to restore the food biodiversity to our fields and orchards and gardens, but make sure that's backed up by a structural diversity of community kitchens, flour mills, meat processing plants, fermentation canneries, and a variety of other things, so that if one old farmer dies or one old dairyman dies, the whole community isn't left without anyone knowing what to do. And the miracle, untold miracle of our lifetimes, is that the seed-saving movement, of which many of you have participated in since 1985, heirloom seeds, who knew that word 25 years ago. Now you can go into a restaurant and they say, we have an heirloom tomato salad. You say, well, what kind of heirloom? And they say, the heirloom tomato is in your salad. You say, wait a minute, that's not what we wanted, but anyway. But we've gone from 5,000 varieties being exchanged by seed savers in this country to over 20,000. And if we look at what all the great small seed companies and community seed libraries, 150 community seed libraries in this country now are doing, it's more like 22 to 25,000 vegetable, grain, and fruit varieties are being exchanged among gardeners and small-scale seedsmen. That's remarkable, a fourfold increase in less than 30 years. At the same time, this is happening with livestock. Who ever thought that we'd have city council debates about backyard poultry in 100 towns in the West, and it changing literally what we see in farmers markets? But think about how 30 years ago we saw cattle across the West, and now we have sheep dairies and goat dairies, and I don't think there's any bison dairies yet, thank God. But the point is that bison...
that makes buffalo cheese, they do.
Mozzarella. But that's not water buffalo, it's bison?
No, it's actually, you know what, it's probably water buffalo,
It's-
but I guess they're a different species.
You can't buffalo me, okay. So this is a map of the distribution of grass-fed, range-fed, pasture-fed goats, sheep, cattle, and bison in the West. And it's just flourishing, as many of you know. And as the next thing shows, we've just put out a publication that's downloadable online for free, Conservation You Can Taste. It'll be available as a book through Amazon.com, print on demand, in another 3 weeks, that tells the story of how literally hundreds of these crops that we just had a handful of seeds, like this white Sonora wheat 30 years ago, are now providing the livelihoods for over 400 farmers across the country. Does this matter? It matters in a big way, because diversity is now being valued even in urban farmers markets where people didn't have the cognition of what it takes to bring back a wheat and a flour mill and a malting, floor malting facility and microbreweries and hops growers and all of that. But the revival of this, the oldest wheat in North America, has brought back all the other elements in the food web that go along with that. And by the way, this wheat does not cause wheat allergies. It's deep-rooted, and if you slow ferment its flour, and the phytates and other things go through the microbial transformation, you will not get sick from this wheat.
The name again?
White Sonora.
White Sonora, where can I get seeds?
Hayden Flour Mills, Native Seed Search has the things. Hayden Flour Mills sells the wheat berries and the flour. So this is the participatory part. This stuff has been going on for 25 years. Many of you have been part of it. On 25th anniversaries, a lot of couples renew their vows. And so I'd like you to all stand up, and we're going to renew our vows. Now the trouble, I've only done this one other time, and people took it too seriously, and they didn't show up the next day to the conference because they were all, honeymooning or something. So I'll do a line, and then I want you to do a line, just like Pete Seeger's folk songs. Remember that stuff? Okay. So with this first line, you say I, and then you say your name, and then you say which of those things you are. I Gary Nabhan, eater. Okay. Wish to renew our sacred vows.
Wish to renew our sacred vows.
To care, love, and serve.
To care, love, and serve.
The astonishing diversity of life on this earth.
The astonishing diversity of life on this earth.
Through sickness and in health.
Through sickness and health.
In times of crisis and times of joy.
In times of crisis and times of joy.
To sow the seeds of food justice.
To sow the seeds of food justice.
To sow the seeds of food security.
To sow the seeds of food security.
To sow the seeds of food democracy.
To sow the seeds of food democracy.
To sow the seeds of true food sovereignty.
To sow the seeds of true food sovereignty.
Through our own actions and our own eating patterns.
Through our own actions and our own eating patterns.
So that we may all reap and eat.
So we may all reap and eat.
What we have truly sown.
What we have truly sown.
I reaffirm our covenant with this earth.
I reaffirm our covenant with this earth.
To be just one more way.
To be just one more way.
That seeds themselves.
That seeds themselves.
Regenerate into more seeds to nourish all of us.
Regenerate into more seeds that nourish all of us.
Now go out to love and serve this diversity.
Now go out to love and serve this diversity.
In and among us.
In and among us.
In community.
In community.
And in peace.
And in peace.
God bless you. I love you all. I used to finish that up with, "You may now pollinate the bride," but my wife made me take that out.
Oh, that's better.
Thank you for an excellent talk. My question concerns hedgerows.
Hedgerows.
The federal government has made it legal to farm from fence to fence. There's no hedgerows anymore. I miss seeing them as a person who used to run around in farming communities. But is there a way of getting that law reversed so that we can have hedgerows? So that's a place where the butterflies and the birds and the little critters all live. I mean, I'm heartbroken. I went to Maryland, which is a bird sanctuary, and there was not a single bird who was there over 8 hours.
Let's talk about
The same
that.
thing has happened here in Boulder. Boulder is officially an Audubon
Hotspot or important birding area, yeah. No, so what we're talking about is the loss of hedgerows from the farmscapes, something unimaginable even to our grandparents, okay? I work with a woman who grew up on a dairy farm in Wales. She said that the fence rows were 30 feet wide everywhere between fields on their farm, and that was not a loss of productivity. In fact, one of my friends in British Columbia has shown that by taking land out of cultivation and putting it back into wildflower plantings or hedgerows that serve not only as habitat for pollinators, but many other beneficial insects, that total area yields actually go up rather than down, even though there's less land in the crop area, because the pollinators are now the limiting factor. So we are bringing back hedgerows to southern Arizona. Wild Farm Alliance, based in Watsonville, California, has planted with crop and other organizations there 18 miles of hedgerows south of the Bay Area in one valley alone, and this is spreading like wildflowers. 18 states have now given pollinator hedgerows and wildflower plantings priorities for Natural Resource Conservation District on-farm habitat grants. So after destroying tens of thousands of miles of hedgerows in this country, now we're waking up and trying to redo that. So thank you for your concerns. Yeah. Yeah. Here's a mic so we can all hear you. And again, I'll repeat the question, but please try to speak so that people can hear you the first time, and I'll rephrase it.
So I heard you, I thought, say that we needed to use Monsanto's Roundup responsibly, or farmers needed to use it responsibly.
What I'm saying is that I know farmers who will not give up Roundup on some things. I don't use Roundup, but I don't think Roundup is going to disappear from the face of the earth immediately. And I want training for farmers on how to minimize its use to the absolute minimum, because I don't think we'll get anything but pushback if we say cold turkey something that's been one of the major tools that people have used. And so I'm not a pro Roundup guy, but I'm a pro-reconciliation guy.
Because I think I've heard Vandana Shiva talk a lot about how it has caused so much havoc in India. And, it just concerns me to hear you speak about Roundup as being something that we should use at all.
What I am trying to do is a stepwise collaborative shift in how we farm that doesn't leave people behind. And again, I know that there's 70-year-old farmers in my county that if I said, could you please stop using that Roundup, they'd say, get off my property.
Although with education, don't you think that would lead to...
What I'm saying is I'd like to see farmers educate other farmers and begin the process of reducing it in time to affect monarch populations now, because I don't think we have time to get Roundup out of the marketplace in time to save milkweeds and monarchs on this. So we can differ in our strategies, but I'm in total respect for what you're saying. I am not a Roundup fan. My farm's organic. And I think Roundup is one of the most easily overused things there is. That's why we're in the deep crap that we are.
And it's a very political topic.
It absolutely is. And yet, how do we walk in for the middle so that we bring people along? And that's my concern.
Hi, I have a question about a new grain. I don't think it's genetically modified. I think it might be a hybrid. It's called quinoa, and it's a perennial grain. And there's a lot of good talk about this in terms of creating no-till farming, and I'm not sure how it works for pollinators, but do you know anything about it?
Well, I'm confused. There's quinoa, which is an ancient grain. There's what's West Jackson's? It's not called Kansa. What's what? Kernza. Kernza, what's come out of the Land Institute that several speakers mentioned today. It's now a perennial grain that has reasonable yields. Its milling and flavor factors need to be worked on, according to all the chefs I know that have done it. In other words, these things ultimately have to pass the eater test too, not just the agriculturalist test. And so there's people working on that element too, and I endorse everything that Wes Jackson does. He's not just one of my heroes, but I think he's redefined the discussion about what truly sustainable agriculture is. In the back there.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. Question for you. This year, Coloradans are going to be planting hemp for the first time in however many years, 30, 50 years. And my question for you is, what do you think will be the positives and negatives of that? What could you suggest for us who want to go ahead and plant hemp? What should we look for?
You know, every time I think about hemp, I realize that the most remarkable participatory plant breeding, grassroots, non-centralized plant breeding experiment in history has been the increase in THC content in cannabis over the last 30 years. I mean, it's remarkable that, compared to the railroad weed that I knew in the Midwest growing up, this stuff is beyond my imagination. And what I think is remarkable is that some of the biggest Tea Party conservative and libertarian states are now on board with medical marijuana and hemp production for its fibers. And I think it's remarkable that in part some very conservative guys who went through a lot of suffering in the Vietnam era remember that plant got them through the jungles and incredible horrors, and that it may get them through some very difficult times later in their life. And so, like a lot of interesting things right now, like raw milk cheese, there's this ideological horseshoe that's happening where libertarians and liberals, or what you ever want to call them, are almost touching. And food, local food, and hemp and marijuana, medical marijuana, are the common ground. Don't talk to the same people about sports, religion, the economy, or politics. But food and marijuana, they're on board. And I think we need to take advantage of that.
Hi, my question is, I loved your presentation, thank you so much, and I'm so glad you know Joel, I've known him for a while, and it's just wonderful seeing this.
I love him, so I love to tease him.
And he loves that too, he's cool. The thing that, like I talked to Joel privately about last night, that he didn't get a chance to answer, but we had a really cool talk, is this: where do you draw the line when it comes to true food sovereignty and your personal rights to eat the foods of your choice for your physical and bodily health? Because I don't know if you know, there was a ruling a couple years ago in Wisconsin, I think September 2011, where they basically said, you do not have the right to eat the foods of your own choice or for your children, and you don't have the right to physical bodily health. You only have a right to eat what the government allows you. And then 3 weeks later, that judge retired and works for Monsanto. And I'm not joking, you check it out, it's crazy. Where do you draw the line in your personal farm when they cross the line and said, you can't do that, you can't do this? And the way that I figured out how to get out of it was to be non-commercial. That's their nexus. And everything in our life is commercial. You know how the Supreme Court ruled on the pot laws in California, somebody grew it for their own use? They said, even though you're not commercial, you could sell it, therefore we have jurisdiction. So they could say you could have on anything.
So this is where we get that ideological horseshoe, you know, where a lot of Tea Party people who don't want the government in our lives, I wonder if those people like libraries and schools, but you know, that's one thing. But my point is that a lot of people say the true definition of food security and food sovereignty is affordable access to culturally appropriate foods, so that sending soybeans to an Indian reservation that has high diabetes and saying, here's a high protein content food, and by the way, it's government surplus and we subsidized all the production of soybeans. You have to eat that to deal with your diabetes rather than the traditional foods, just seems like an absurdity to me. So the point is, we all have the right to be conscientious objectors and anarchists in the best sense of that term. And I think we practice our right to do what Americans have done all along, which is to be absolutely contrarian when we need to be, and that's how change happens.
Are any of the ones, what I'm doing right now is helping people, because I've had friends lose their farms because they go, Greg, I don't want to do it your way. I want to continue to go to the farmers markets. I want to sell my stuff in this store. And I said, the downside, when you do really good stuff, like I've had 2 raw milk cheese friends, the FDA came in and we shut them down, and they were brutal. I'm talking.
No, and that's happening, and that's why there's this enormous food sovereignty movement that began in Maine with local food sovereignty laws. And in some places like Maine, the state ag and health departments have said, we're not going to fight our neighbors on those issues. Let's put it aside. So let's keep that discussion going. Thank you.
Are anybody doing non-commercial co-op things so they don't have a nexus? It's just private to the group so that they can't find a way in commercially.
They are, and why would I announce who they are?
Oh, no, that's what I meant. You don't have to announce it there, but I'm wondering if you're...
Thank you. You know, it's happening all over the place.
Another question. Last one.
Okay, there is a policy in Boulder County of pulling out the yucca as a non-native plant. And they've got a number of other plants that I doubt are non-native. I think they're native. I think that the biostructure of Boulder has really been changed by the presence of the herbalists. And the thing is I consider myself an herbalist. But they picked, the rule of what used to be, you picked half of what was there. Now they pick everything in sight.
I'm going to refer that to the herbalist standing next to you, or the herbalist rows beyond you, because I don't know enough about your place, and I'd be humbled I just don't have the knowledge base to do it, so why don't we have an answer that,
I would just say, I think it depends. I mean, anyone who's it's definitely part of the training I had as an herbalist, and definitely the training I give to people is how to wild craft ethically. And that's actually something I'm talking about tomorrow. But so it should be a part of the training of any herbalist or anyone who's out doing that. I agree that anytime you commodify something, there's always that risk that people are going to go and take it all just because they can get more for it. But it's definitely part of the training out there. So I would hope any herbalists in Boulder are ethically wildcrafting. But it is an issue, definitely.
anyone who has some more feedback on that, why don't we have a little discussion group on this? I know some of you need to get up, and you don't want to get up for taking another vow, so let's say goodbye now, and thank you so much for coming out tonight.